And then in verse 11, I think this is something that's very important to understand about the state today of LDS scholarship. I'm not an expert at this. This is my opinion. I would not consider myself an LDS scholar. I do not have a scholarly training, but I read a lot, and I see a lot of presentations and talks, and so I've got, I dip my toe, so to speak, in the world of academia, especially LDS scholarship. Here's what verse 11 says: proving to the world that the Holy Scriptures, this is the Book of Mormon, and those that minister and talk about the Book of Mormon, proving to the world that the Holy Scriptures are true, and that God does inspire men and call them to his holy work in this age and generation, as well as in generations of old, thereby showing that he is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. That's where we oftentimes get the theme of one eternal round with those phrases. But it's important to understand that the Book of Mormon is what proves the other scriptures true. So often we get now from scholarship this new influx, a very great new influx, right? It's kind of like the allegory in Jacob 5, right, from Zenos, the allegory of the olive trees, of the vineyard, where you have a grafting in of the wild branches to offer life, right? Think of it in these two ways. You've got something that's very orderly. Let's call it even conservative, very conservative, right? And you've got a very conservative view, very status quo of the gospel and of scripture study. And so in many ways, it kind of dies off a little bit. There's not enough life in it. And so you bring in the wild branches. This is just like you have Israel and then you have the Gentiles coming in, right? And so you bring in the wild branches. And what do the wild branches offer? They offer more perspective. They offer new energy, new life to that olive tree and to the vineyard, right? It's important to have it. And we've had an influx of this in LDS scholarship, especially since about the 80s and 90s. And so about the last 20, 30 years, there's been a real influx of what? Of students that have gone off to other universities around the world, around the country, and get training in biblical scholarship. Great training in biblical scholarship. And then they come back, they may go to BYU or to another university, and they write in a religious way about the gospel of Jesus, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. These are usually members of the church. But apart from just bringing in life into LDS scholarship, right, they also bring in a little bit of, let's call it, their wild branches. And so there's some, you get sometimes the opposite of what we should be seeing. We see methods of biblical scholarship being used to try and apply them to the Book of Mormon, right? And trying even to try and prove the Book of Mormon. That's not a bad thing, but it's not what the Book of Mormon is for. The Book of Mormon is the primary tool to prove the rest of the scriptures true. And oftentimes in scholarship, you'll notice this if you study a lot, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, we see the opposite. People trying to use Isaiah to prove the Book of Mormon, or putting a more secular or non-LDS filter, which can be good, again, a new perspective sometimes, but sometimes it's a non-LDS perspective, and training can also come in, and it actually pulls directly away from the purpose of the restoration and the purpose of the Book of Mormon. And these are great scholars, right? They'll write about the Book of Mormon using their biblical scholarship training. And it's good training, but it's not all the way the Lord tells us to study the scriptures. It's not using the Book of Mormon and then applying it to the Bible, for example, right? It's usually the other way around. And it's like, okay, wait a minute here. Wait a minute. You're taking a particular point of view or a a more broadly Christian point of view or a Jewish point of view, whatever it might be. And you're trying to bring that back and say, okay, this is how I was trained. This is what I learned. And so now I'm going to try and put this onto the Book of Mormon. Okay. Again, wild branches grafted in. That's going to give life to scholarship. And there is so much wonderful scholarship. And yes, I'll say in many different areas, in many different organizations, both within the church and then going even broader into Mormon Studies, which is something that is building quite a bit. It's growing quite a bit outside of the church and outside of members of the church and member scholars. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this, because the narrative, the scholarly narrative of let's call it Mormon Studies, is not going to be controlled by LDS scholars soon. That's the way I see it. It will not be controlled by LDS scholars. It's going to be controlled by this large growing group, which we want, right? But it's going to be, the narrative is going to be owned outside of the church on scholarly things, in the scholarly world, right? In the academic world. It's not going to be, it'll be, you're going to have two different camps. You're going to have those that are trying to be disciple scholars that were told that, for example, those at the Maxwell Institute should be by President Holland. And then you're going to have the other scholars outside of that are focused on Mormon studies, that are looking from the outside in. It's a good perspective to see, but it's going to dominate things soon. And it's going to dominate soon inside of the disciple scholar world as well, I think. It's going to be a hard thing soon there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict with that. But my point here is, in verse 11, we need to look at the Book of Mormon as the primary tool to prove the other scriptures. That is what is going to happen as we gather Israel, both in the Gentile Christian world and in the Jewish world. When that happens, the Book of Mormon is what is going to come back, and we need to think more along the lines of the Old Testament, especially, right, with the Jewish world and with gathering Israel. That is what is going to prove the Old Testament, where we can see that maybe things might start to falter there. And it's going to prove the New Testament as well, of course. And of course, we look at our other restorative scriptures with the Book of Moses and the Book of Abraham, and with the Doctrine and Covenants here. It's the Book of Mormon that proves them to be true. That's the starting point. The Book of Mormon tells us the truth. We're going to see something very soon here, where they're already seeing it in the Christian world, where there's going to be critical theory that is going to, again, my opinion here, but critical theory is going to come in with a heavy dose of postmodernism, and it is going to criticize, it's going to take a critical approach to the Bible like we've never seen before. And it's going to be about the oppressor and the oppressed. And it is going to be about intersectionality. And it's going to be about man versus woman. And it's going to be about parents versus children. And it's going, everything you can think of in breaking everything apart, deconstructing it. That is a postmodern term. Deconstructing the Bible. That's what postmodernism is built for. And that's what dominates in academia today. And so we need these new cornerstones of doctrine to keep us on the right track, because the Bible, being what is very broadly known out there, right, is going to get hammered. It is going to get hammered. And we're going to need to pull on the Book of Mormon in order to help us keep grounded on things, and to understand that we have an additional. It's kind of like the Book of Mormon comes in, and as the Bible will become a little bit shaky on its ground, it will, as this deconstruction starts to overpower it. The Book of Mormon for us is going to come in and sit underneath that Bible and hold it up. That's what I see anyway.